And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. This is Love Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio, the number one African Caribbean online radio, where we bring you all the best of music, entertainment, edutainment, history, culture, what have you, about the mothership Africa. Folks, if it's Saturday and at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, as we all know, is today's Africa. And today we have a very special guest. And the guest that we have, folks, as you all know, when we come on this program, we always ask our guests to introduce themselves because they do that work for us to be able to proceed with the program. They know themselves, and I have no other person than Mr. Ibrahim B. Anoba. Mr. Ibrahim, good morning.
Good morning to you. How are you doing, sir?
I am super. I am super. It's great to have you on this program. Honestly speaking,
It's my
I
pleasure.
was going after you for some time, and when I saw that you had responded, you don't know, I went for my cola nuts, and I celebrated so much so that you know what, you don't know how excited I am to have you on this program, and for that.
I guarantee you, I'm more excited to be on your show than you probably are.
Oh my God! It was just like I had been trying to get you, and because of your expertise, because I read so much about you, and um, I said to myself that I had to get hold of you. So, having said that, who is Ibrahim Anoba?
Well, thank you for having me. It's my pleasure to be part of your show. Uh, I'm a big fan of anything that has to do with uh, discussing issues that affect Africans in in the 21st century. And of course, your platform offers a great avenue for that. And for that reason, I'm extremely grateful for what you do. And of course, having me on the platform is a great pleasure of mine. My name again is Ibrahim Babatunde Anoba, and I am the managing editor at African Liberty. And African Liberty is one of the continent's first media platform that is solely dedicated to advancing freedoms, particularly individual freedom and economic freedom. Established in 2009 as a project of the Cato Institute, but now housed within African Student for Liberty. Uh, but on the side, I'm also the Africa Fellow at the Center for African Prosperity at the Atlas Network, which is based here in Arlington, Virginia. And besides that, I am a historian of West Africa, and my focus when it comes to African history is in 19th and 20th century social and freedom movements on the continent, particularly in West Africa. Uh, so I'm pretty much, uh, always in the historical space as much as I am in the political economic space as far as Africa is concerned.
Interesting, very, very great, great indeed. You see, we use also to add to what you said. Um, Africa has been, portrayed negatively when it comes to mainstream media and other channels, putting it the correct way. And nobody else will tell our story if we don't tell our story because it becomes convoluted when somebody from the outside tells our stories for them. Then I would term that to be his story, not our story. And for us to be able to put the right light on Africa and focus on I always call it the mothership, we need people and I mean establishments like yours to be able to do that. When I was going through the atlasnetwork.org, I saw some of the partners that your organization has been working with. So interesting. Heavy hitters like the Global Directory, Global Council of CEOs, Center for Latin America, Center for African Prosperity, Center for US and Canada. So, in my beliefs, I think you have something to offer Africa by sort of partnering with all these people to to shed better light on Africa. Can you tell us a little bit about your partners, please?
Sure. So you put it right, but I'll just elaborate further. So at the Atlas Network, what we do is we support um, think tanks, organizations that are dedicated to advancing freedom across the world. And we have dozens of partners from organizations that are much more policy oriented or think tanks to organizations that are involved in judicial processes that focus only on defending human rights and dignity. But on the African continent, we have about 20 partners, and some of them have been ranked among the most influential or impactful think tanks across the continent. For example, one of our partners in Ghana, Imani, is Ghana's number one think tank, and of course, it's been ranked by the UPenn Global Directory of Think Tanks and the World Bank as Ghana's foremost think tank. So, you want to talk about any policy issue in Ghana today? The place you want to go outside the government is to go to Imani, and the folks there are amazing experts. So we have other partners in Rwanda, I'm sorry, in Burundi, in South Africa, Nigeria, Malawi, across the continent of Africa. And what we do at the Atlas Network is that we offer them trainings to give them much uh, assured skill sets to add to the amazing skill sets when it comes to addressing complex organizational problems. And of course, we offer them grants and platforms to collaborate with other like-minded think tanks across the continent. So we pride ourselves in there being people interested in bringing freedom to their countries on the African continent and outside the African continent together and offering them what they will need to achieve that freedom. So that's pretty much what the Center for African Prosperity does at the Atlas Network.
Oh, very well. And I would like to introduce also to you my co-host, Reverend Father Ken Kosa, who is in Toronto with me. Father Kosa, good morning. Yes.
Good morning, sir. Good morning, friend. How is everybody going? I'm doing fine by the grace of God.
Everybody is so good. Everybody is so good. As you are aware, we have Mr. Anoba on the line from Maryland. And then we are going to be, as you know, we are going to be discussing the topic leadership crisis. Is there any leadership crisis on the continent of Africa? And you know what?
Mm,
As you are aware, Father Kosa, Africa doesn't need charity. It needs good leadership.
hmm
And over the years, we've seen not development, but a lot of problems in Africa. The old train has left, the new train in power right now. I don't know where they are taking the continent to. We have so many problems going against Africa. Africa is a sleeping giant, as we've been discussing on this platform. And Mr. Anoba is here for us to be able to put into context and to map out where the problems lie. And is it indeed
mm.
that we have problems in terms of leadership in Africa? We will see about that. And Mr. Anoba is the right person at this particular point in time for us to be able to discuss the issue. And I know you were listening to it. What's your take on it before we go into the main meat of the topic?
I'm grateful to join, Mr. Anoba Ibrahim. It's a pleasure to have you, and I'm particularly interested. I'm particularly happy about the fact that you are also into not just governance, but also into is it media promoting things about Africa, especially looking from not just outside of it, but as an insider looking from outside. Oftentimes, it is outsiders who look from outside, and so I'm particularly happy about what you're doing. But I want to ask this question as Uncle Tio began. Um, the issue of portraying Africa out there. Since you work with think tanks in Africa, um, I believe that you've had the task of talking Africa, discussing Africa, and all that. When it comes to Africans or Africans, when I say Africans, I talk about African in the diaspora and portraying what Africa is like. What is the template like? Do we have Africans dedicated to doing that? And what is the state of, or what is the state of that particular thing? Because um, Africans need to portray Africa well, and so I'm asking that do we have people? How many more people like you are out there showing Africa, not just directing, but just talking positively or talking critically about Africa?
Thank you for that question. And I think it's very important for us to um, often, take a little step back to reflect on how uh, we represent our continent, regardless of if you are based on the continent of Africa itself or you are in its diaspora. I think individuals like yourself and your platform are doing an
Mm,
amazing job to not only bring uh, issues affecting the continent into discussions, but also identifying what makes the African. So your question is more about who is the African and what constitutes Africa itself.
mm,
And as you know, Africa is not only about the continent. Africa is the African diaspora. It's about anyone who loves the continent and identifies with it, not necessarily having to be a native of any African ethnic group. And of course, uh, Africa as a conception that has no physical representation. I'm talking about Africa as an idea, the idea of Pan Africanism, of uh, a kind of non physical connection between anyone who has a genealogical antecedent on the continent, wherever they are located today, or anyone who subscribes to the idea of African unity or African solidarity. So, what constitutes the African itself, uh, has to do with things that are beyond the physical. So, if you are an
mm,
African in the diaspora and you uh, identify with the continent, you help promote the real or true identity of the continent in your own spaces, as you are doing at Love Bay, and that makes you an African as well. And I tried as much as possible not to join the argument of defining who is an African, because it's not an individual doesn't necessarily have to be a big fan of African to be African. For example, there are some folks in the U.S. media who are black people whose ancestors came from Africa, but they are always the first to condemn anything black, anything African. So
mhm,
if this officer kneels on the neck of a black man and kills him on the street of Minnesota, they will still not see any discrimination in that. Whereas they are black people. So I'm going to say those individuals because they do not subscribe to defending the black man or the black woman, then we can consider them to be non-Africans. So it's really a complex undertaking to say you want to define what the African is. But in my own understanding, I believe anyone who identifies with the continent, whether you are born on the continent or not, you are to some extent an African. So what connotes an African in a specific space has to be subjective.
Mm, mm, mm. Thank you. That's deep, and that's really really deep and insightful. And the discussion of who an African is. I mean, the brief discussion of who an African is, expanding it not just to the place or to the color, but rather to the concept, to the ideology, to the belief in Africa is very very important. I'm really grateful about it. God bless you, and I hope that as we discuss this, we'll get there. Thank you. I'm with you.
Yeah, thank you for an insightful kind of discussion. Folks out there, on the Today's Africa program, we don't interview, as you know, we chat. And with us today is Mr. Ibrahim Anoba, who is the managing editor of the African Liberty. Well, we'll go back to that before the end of the show because it's a very, very great site, news, analysis, and everything that you may want to know about Africa and the diaspora is put across. Because we know that the African Union has divided Africa into 6 regions: North, South, East, West, Central, and the diaspora, as we know. Okay, going into the meat of the problem, Mr. Anoba, what do you think are some of the causes of this leadership crisis that we sort of we see or we have in Africa right now? Because it seems like we are not moving, we are going back. Sometimes we go back, we go forward, and there's a lot of problems that is plaguing Africa right now. Sometimes I sit back here and feels like I want to cry because if you sit from the outside looking in, you know that some of these leaders have lived in the West or in the East, and they've seen what progress, what it has taken for them to build their countries. And yet, when they go back and they are given leadership roles, everything goes asunder. What are some of the things that you believe strongly are some of the causes? The floor is yours, please. Go ahead.
Thank you for that question. I think this question is perhaps one of the most treated questions when it comes to discussing Africa, at least from 1970 until now. The idea of Africa is plagued by leadership crisis, which of course is true. Of course, everything comes and what was how I forget how the English is said. Everything falls and rises on leadership, and of course, you can hardly find or, or point to a problem in today's Africa that doesn't have to do with leadership. Are you talking about poverty or unemployment or insecurity? Majority of these problems emanates from leadership. But of course, experts and scholars have done justice to that. But I'll just try to uh, dwell on three of the most important layers of this problem that I've identified. And first among the problem is that, which of course people do not really often emphasize, which I think we have to emphasize all the time, is that Africa, as it is today, is operating under ideas and true structures inherited from colonial rule. So you come to Nigeria or you go to the average African country, you will hardly find administrative structures or national power sharing structures that has nothing to do with what that country used to be under colonial rule. So take for Nigeria, for example, the 1999 constitution as amended, which of course is what the country operates under, is in many, many, many ways a reflection of colonial rule, a reflection of what colonialism put in place. So you have national resource sharing structure that is in many ways uh, 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 a rehash of what the colonial and military officers had imposed on the country. You consider the power structure or the um, authority adjustment or rights of state governments, local governments, or the federal government, and you really cannot escape but notice that many of these constitutional provisions were first kept in place by colonialists and, of course, emboldened by the military dictators. And now, even democratically elected governments are, are strengthening these structures. It's the same in Cote d'Ivoire, it's the same in many of the Southern African countries. So why must we, um, of course, observe that we do have leadership crisis in Africa or government administrative crisis in Africa, whereas we are not ready to have frank conversations about designing constitutions that work for Africa of today. You cannot be operating a mobile device in 2021 using the iOS or the software from 10 years ago, not to make mention uh, of 60 years ago. It's unfathomable. If you want to have a prosperous country in the 21st century, you have to design a constitution that addresses problems in the 21st century, not a constitution that is based on, on selfishness and concentration of power in the central government. The goal of the colonial government was to concentrate as much power in the central administration. So even in English colonies, where the colonizers emphasized indirect rule or allowed traditional institutions to be liaisons between themselves and the subjects or the people, you can still see uh, structures that ensures that economic resources, political power firmly resides in the central government. So I do not see any way that the continent can progress if we are still operating largely under constitutions or administrative structures inherited from colonial rule. And the second problem I think I often try to make people understand is that Africa is where it is today, largely because we've neglected our indigenous traditions, indigenous political structures, indigenous values. So before colonization of the continent or the partition in 1884-85, of course, many would say Africa started being colonized in the 15th century by Portuguese, but whichever way, without those foreign impositions, indigenous Africa have always operated uh, through political structures that ensured that even if you have a king or you have a queen, those monarchs have have some customs or institutions that ensure that they do not grossly mismanage power. So, in centralized indigenous African institutions where you have the king as the main authority, where the king can decide anything, the king doesn't necessarily always decide anything because there are religious institutions, the religious cults, the, the religious cults. We've always had the religious cults from ancient Egyptian societies to the Western African kingdoms of the Ashanti, the Fanti, the Yoruba, the Dahomey, and whatnot. There are always indigenous spiritual institutions or cults that make sure that the king cannot go overboard. Even if the king is exercising divine rights, he still cannot decide to rule the people any way he wants without being considerate of their emotions, without being considerate of their economic state. In Yoruba land, for instance, in the whole Oyo Empire, if a king decides to go overboard to be incompetent and found of gross mismanagement, there is an institution called the Oyomesi, the Council of I think elders, ritual elders, who can check the king. They will give him the calabash, and he has an option either to leave the kingdom or to commit suicide. There are checks against powerful institutions or centralized political institutions in Africa that make sure that this centralized political institution or powerful political institution do not exercise gross abuse of power as we've seen in current Africa or contemporary Africa rather. And in societies, in indigenous Africa, where there were no heavily centralized political systems, that political decisions depended on consensus, where there was no kings or queens. I'm talking about societies like the Igbo society or the Tiv society, where there were councils of elders or certain councils that represent the apex of political authority. Some societies in indigenous Africa never like kings, they never like queens. They never believe anybody should have absolute power in the society. Those societies had consensus councils where every issue, economic decision, security decision has to be deliberated over and over and over again. And when a consensus emerged, that consensus will be adopted by every household head. And even if that consensus is being found by some other divisions within the community, like the age groups or the spiritual groups, those groups has the right to question the consensus of the council. So the idea that deliberation or democracy or legislative system of government emerged in ancient Greek and Europeans brought it to Africa and enlightened Africans is absolutely false. Those idea of consultative government, of discursive government, were already in Africa before the first European enslavers or European colonialists set foot on Africa. So what I'm saying in essence is that these two reasons, uh, um, inheriting administrative structures from colonial rule, applying them to 2021 Africa, and neglecting our indigenous values, indigenous political institutions, uh, have made you know certain challenges that emanate from leadership failure in Africa today to be so rampant. If there were checks and balances in today's Africa as it existed in indigenous African institutions, I do not think today Nigerians will be crying that a president would decide to leave the country in the middle of crisis and go seek medical attention in Europe when you have billions and billions spent on healthcare annually. Indigenous African values will never tolerate that for a king.
Yes. Wow. Interesting. Reverend Kosa, any comment on that? Very beautiful and well said.
Um, let me throw in this controversial thing. If leaders are chosen from a bunch of people, and today there's a public notion that um, we have a leadership crisis in Africa, or at least our leaders are have a leadership have crisis in leadership. Can we just conjecture then that the African people themselves don't seem to be good enough to lead their people in the 21st century?
Well, I think as funny as that question sounds, it's a very prevalent question in today's Africa. And I think it was yesterday that I was on Instagram and I was looking at it must have been one of the recent comments made by the American ambassador to Nigeria, where he was saying, "Well, Nigeria is bewildered with these problems, but Nigerians know the solutions. They just don't want to do it." And in the comment section, some folks were saying, "Well, uh, they decide to give us independence where we were not ready for independence. That Africa generally wasn't ready for independence in the 60s or 70s. That we should have continued to be under colonial rule so that we can, learn and mature politically, so that we wouldn't have been suffering from the problems that we are suffering from today." Of course, so as much as that argument, sound funny, because who will ever want to be under colonial rule in 2021? It's still a very prevalent discussion. But to answer your question, uh, I do not think um, Africans are incapable of leading Africans because if you go back to our history, let's say you go back um, pre 1600, you will find out that some of the prosperous, the most flourishing civilization or cultures or city states, a lot of them were in Africa. Of course,
Yeah.
it's that the first, perhaps the first civilization that flourished remarkably was the ancient Egyptian society, which of course is a black civilization. But of course, there are societies or civilizations like the Aksumite civilization in the Horn of Africa, or the Benin Empire, or the Songhai, or the Ghana, or the Mali, or the numerous empires in Africa that were the center of international trade in antiquity, in the centuries before the modern times, before the early modern period. So if those African societies or African empires flourished under the leadership of Africans, so how can we then say that Africans are incapable of leading themselves? Well, the difference is that the political system or the tools within the political system that ensured right leadership or good leadership then are largely absent today.
Mm.
And as funny as this may sound, indigenous African societies, if you want to be a chief, you want to be the head of a certain project in the community, you'll have to swear by the gods. You have to
Mm.
take a oath. As crazy as
Mm.
that might sound, you have to take a oath. And if you take the oath, of course you wouldn't want to mismanage the community wealth or the commonwealth.
No way.
And if you do that, of course, the wrath of the gods would be felt the person. But today, that is not the case. We think any leader has to be supervised by some anti-graft agencies, whereas the anti-graft agencies that existed in indigenous African institutions were spiritual. If a
Mm.
king or a
Mm.
will manage the wealth, the spiritual organization we sorry, they will uh what's the English? They will consult the gods for the person, or they will invoke the spirits of the ancestors. Today, if a leader mismanages, if a public office, what people will do is call on the on anti-corruption agencies, which of course are mere mortals or mere humans. But anyway, this is an example of how things were done in the past, where Africa were under African leaders and flourished, and how things today are being done with Africa under Africans, and the disparity in development or responsibility is so glaring.
Hmm. Uncle T, if I may
No,
do a
no,
follow up.
no. Yeah, go ahead.
Uh, I asked that question. I asked that question because I personally believe that to some extent we've forgotten or we've lost who we actually are. Africans have had, like you said, um, most of the city states that flourished and made marks, even inroads into modern Europe and other parts of the world, were African states. Africa has not been so poor. Africa has the models and system to be able to manage its resources very well. And then this brings me to that issue of leadership, political leadership. From where you stand, I'm sure you'll be able to know how much that the this how much the impact of democracy has had on Africa. I want to ask this question, maybe another very controversial or silly question. Do you think that the African continent needs partisan politics? Personally, I I think partisan politics. I'm not talking about democracy because there are several forms of democracy, I believe. But partisan politics. I believe it has not helped Africa to grow as it should have. What's your take on this?
I think that's a very important question. So here is how I often address that. And again, it goes back to my idea of Africa, today's Africa, being far away, miles and miles away from the foundations that our ancestors operated with. So the idea of partisan politics, as it is practiced today, of course, is foreign. The idea of democracy, as it is practiced today, is foreign to Africa. Of course, there are tenets of democracy that are observable in indigenous Africa. The idea of checks and balances, the rule of law, uh, responsible governance, periodic elections in some kind of way were, of course, observable in certain indigenous African societies. But democracy as it operates today is foreign. And this is how it becomes problematic. So if indigenous African societies had their own forms of democracy, and that worked well for them because politics or political structures becomes only effective as far as your cultural structure goes.
Mm,
So the cultural practice in among the Ashanti, for instance, gives a huge premium to the role of women in deciding who will become the Asante Hini or
mhm.
becomes the council. Whereas in the Oyo Empire, it's not really about the women. The kind of democracy or representative government, which of course is reflective in the household elders representation in the council of the Oba, is not really it does not really give too much credence to the role of women determining who the Alaafin of Oyo becomes, the next Alaafin becomes. So, but in both the Asante case and the Oyo case, there are tenets of democracy like responsible governance, like
Mm,
like uh, deliberation in both cases. Whereas the Asante would never copy the model of Oyo people of the Oyo, whereas the Oyo as well will not copy the model of the Asante because even both of them are pretty much geographically um, uh,
closer.
yeah, they will still respect that their respective cultures, demand certain interpretation of whatever democracy is. So what Africa should have done is that even if we think democracy is the best or is the most is the best among the worst uh, leadership structures or political systems, what we should have done is perhaps adopt democracy from Europe or the colonizers as they gave it to us and refurbish it in the through the African lens. And this is one of the things that African leaders in the 60s and 70s tried to do when they called when they decided that what Africa needed was African socialism. So even in your area of Mboya, even Amaka Cabral often say that, well, we think socialism can help us understand our problems in Africa, but it cannot help us solve them. We only need socialism to help us point out what those problems are, and we will use our indigenous African ideas or structures to solve the problems that socialism have helped us identify. So, in the sense that we are adopting socialism, we are only adopting it as a framework to help us understand our predicaments. What we will use to solve our predicament is not socialism, but our own indigenous African initiative. So, in that case, those African leaders adopted socialism, but they did not use socialism in solving their problems. Even some tenets of it were observable. For example, Jama, to a large extent, can be called socialist structure, but there were indigenous Kiswahili values or Tanzanian or Zanzibari values that Nigeria deployed. But in any case, what I'm trying to say in essence is that even as much as we may not agree with the African socialism that was practiced by the first generation of post-independent African leaders, we can learn one thing, that even if you want to deploy a European or Western structure of governance or administration, what is more reasonable is for you to interpret that structure through your own cultural values. So as much as um, um, China and Russia to some extent practice communism, the kind of communism that Russia operates under is not the same as the one China operates operates with. They both filtered their aspirations and needs through communism, but communism is not what is helping them solving their problems. I mean, how can you call China a communist state when it has much more private companies than many of the countries in the world today? Whereas in a communist state,
mm,
in a utopia communist state, there should not be one private company. Whereas Chinese will tell you they are using communism as a model of government. What the Chinese are doing in essence is that they're adopting a model and helping helping themselves understand their problem through that model, but using their own indigenous cultural values to solve those problems. Many Chinese were entrepreneurial. So indigenous Africans have always been entrepreneurial. We've always appreciated conversational or deliberation to solving specific problems. But today's democracy would only allow the executive, in many cases, the president or the prime minister, to assert on 70% of occasions what the solution to any problem should be. So, what happened to the power of the provincial government, to the state governments, or to the elected representative in the parliament? So, I would not say democracy is the worst approach Africa can adopt. If you look around, you can only find an alternative to democracy that will not end up killing many people or impoverishing people. Democracy is only as good as a specific society adopts it through its own indigenous values. And this is what Africa has failed to do.
And you're listening to
mm.
Love Bay Afrobeat Music Talk Radio, the number one African Caribbean online radio, and the program you're listening to is Today's Africa. And we have as our guest, our special guest, Mr. Ibrahim Anoba, an expert when it comes to African affairs. He's the managing editor of the Africa Liberty magazine. Folks, um, you know what? I was reading something, Mr. Noba. I was reading something before I got into the studio, and what I read, and I'll quote, it says that if there's one thing that African leadership has succeeded in doing over the years, it is to consolidate the persistence of the theory of African dependency. The other success of the contemporary African leader has been the overplaying of the blame game, fluently explaining away every leadership failure by simply highlighting the evils of the colonial legacy, and particularly that of its offshoot, neo-colonial Western imperialistic hegemony. Would that would this assertion be uh, would you say it's okay? I mean, what's your take on it? To put it to put it mildly.
Thank you. So you're absolutely correct on both occasions. Today's Africa is much more of a dependent continent. I mean, we depend on Europe and America from everything from malaria drugs
Toothpick.
to toothpick to food. I mean, we export what we do not have. I'm sorry, we export what we need and we import what we do not need. So yes, Africa is a dependent continent. And I'm not trying to say dependent in being that every country has to exist in isolation. Of course, no country or continent can exist in isolation. The world is intertwined. But Africa's own dependency is so unbelievable, such that there is literally any there is literally no problem that will ever emanate in Africa that Africans will look inward to solve. So when the COVID pandemic was eating the waves like crazily at the beginning of 2020, when many countries decided to invest in their universities, research centers to develop test structures or test models, and eventually perhaps potentially develop vaccines, or even equip the centers to allow them come up with ideas of treating patients with COVID. African leaders were not really doing that. Only in some spare cases or sparse cases that you will find. government spending on hospitals or spending on infrastructure, medical infrastructure. But a lot of them were investing in their universities or research centers. And fast forward 1 year later, when America and China and even Russia heavily invested in their institutions, medical institutions, uh, Africa today now has to pay millions and millions of dollars, if not billions, in acquiring COVID vaccines. Many of those vaccines were developed in Europe and America. Tests or studies were done using Americans, using Europeans, even if they are black Europeans or black Americans. So, and we're gonna accept those vaccines by paying billions of dollars and starting to use them for our people, and we wouldn't expect that there will be some side effects to Africans. This was not vaccine that was developed on the continent. But anyway, what I'm trying to get at with that is that we've become so dependent, such that our dependency uh, is bringing us steps backward when it comes to global competitiveness, from medical to economic. But you're also right when you say Africans often blame everything on colonialism, and many um, um, external internalists who see that Africa's problems are internally created, not necessarily outside, not necessarily from colonialism or imperialism, are in fact correct to a large extent. And this is because 60 years after colonialism, you really cannot keep blaming the British or the French for your problems. The British and the French literally left the continent 60 years ago. Of course, there are still some remnants of imperialism in today's Africa. We cannot hide from saying that. But you cannot keep blaming yourself, or sorry, your problems today on colonialism. I mean, how are we supposed to say in Nigeria in the next 2 months, Nigeria is going to hit some crazy inflation figures? And today or last week, we were alert to the fact that the central bank governor was printing money. So when the inflation eventually hits, how can we then blame that inflation on colonialism? Is it the British that are being that are really focusing on how to fix their monarchy or fix their pandemic infested society that we will be blaming for our problem? I mean, I do not know why people will continue to blame. I mean, of course, see, the reason is that, see, African leaders, like any other leaders in the world, will always find an excuse for their underperformance. And if we are allowing African leaders to keep telling us that the reason why there is no security in high schools in northern Nigeria, or why was this man from Uganda, it's called Yoweri Museveni, we keep brutalizing his opposition figures like Bobby Wine, and the reason for that is imperialism and colonialism. I then think we really need to evaluate our leaders psychologically, because you cannot be seeing A and everybody else is seeing A, and you're going to turn around and tell us that is B. So it's much more about questioning leadership, questioning any insensible excuse that arise or comes out from the president's palace, or from the governors or local council members, when they're trying to find excuses, when they're trying to lay excuses on imperialism or colonialism, when in fact they've underperformed or mismanaged the resources in their custody.
Yeah, Father Kosa, any comment on that?
I quite agree with him, and those of us who know, who've been listening to me, I believe that solutions for the African problem lies within the African continent itself and the African and its own people. And so, my issue has always been that the Africans' biggest problem is taste. And yes, um, for a long time, we were made to believe in the European, or to the, yes, generally the European, Ghana and Nigeria for that matter, to the British particular mode of doing things. But then what I wanted to ask is this. Since he's not, I want to put him within my kind of youth bracket, not necessarily an elderly person. Do you see any hope among the youth? Do you see the youth taking a particular trajectory towards authentic leadership, authentic um, yes, authentic leadership. Let me just put it that way. Do you see any hope among the youth? I know this particular question is very. I'm becoming too subjective, but I just want you to come from that youthful Africanness to tell the world um, how hopeful are we in the coming leaders? Because, like Uncle Theo said, the old train left, and we don't seem to know where the new train is leading. Do you see the potential leaders of Africa possibly leading us to the right direction?
Well, thank you again for that very important question. Uh, so one of the realities that today's Africa has to contend with before it can dream of moving forward is that uh, it loses a lot than it can ever gain by marginalizing its youthful population. I mean, first of all, I do not see any way someone that grew up in the 80s, and with all due respect to the elderly Africans, I do not see how someone that grew up in the 80s or 70s can ever uh, present themselves as having the best solutions to problems of the 21st century, to problems of 2021.
Mhm.
I mean, it's like you're trying to as an institution or as an institute, you're trying to create a software that will make air travel much more um, less of a hassle, and you have an engineer minted or who became an engineer in 2010, being exposed to the latest technologies of the 2010s, and an engineer who became an engineer in the 50s or 60s. So, which among them will you choose? Of course, you will choose most likely the recently minted engineer because
Ah,
they grew up learning not only from the old technologies but through the new technologies. That's how society progressed. Even Africa's own history, recent history. I don't need to go to back. I don't need to go back to draw valid examples. Africa's own recent history. I'm talking about as recent as the 60s or 50s. Africa's recent history points to the fact that the continent will only progress when youths are involved in in politics. The trade unions and labor unions that spearheaded Africa's call, or sorry, the call for the end of colonialism were majority that were mostly dominated by youths, individuals that are not more than 50 years old. I mean, the ANC underground uh, uh, military wing that that to a large extent uh, kept the apartheid government on its toes during the 50s and the 60s were full of young people. Mandela, Desmond Tutu, and the others were pretty much young folks then, where they were running points in South Africa. Mugabe, before he became what he was today, what he was in recent years, was a young person. Nkrumah, who in many ways is perhaps the most significant political figure in post-colonial Africa, when he was with the UGGC, that's the United Gold Coast Convention.
Convention.
I forgot
Yes.
convention.
convention.
Mhm.
Even even though the majority of the GGC Big Six, I'm talking about Dankwa and Grant and others were older folks, they still relied on the fresh ideas of Kwame Nkrumah, who of
Yes.
course was recently coming from Europe. He's been he's been around the best, or sorry, the most influential Pan Africanists like W.B. Du Bois, Paul Robeson, Marcus Garvey's wife, and whatnot. When he came to Ghana, and of course later formed his own CPP, the Convention People's Party, his idea was so refreshing, even though I might not agree with many of his solutions. His idea was so refreshing, such that uh, he propelled Ghana to independence in '56. The same thing applies to other leaders in Africa. Hastings Banda,
Mhm.
Jomo Kenyatta, at the point where they were running the anti-colonial movement, they were actually young people. You look at Tom Mboya, that was the chairman of the 1958 All African People's Congress in Accra.
Yeah.
He was a young man. Amilcar Cabral, all these people were young people. Thomas Sankara. So they brought independence to Africa as young men. And of course, you may not agree with majority of the ideas, but at least they ushered independence to Africa as young men. So who are we today to say the 28-year-old, the 40-year-old or the 35-year-old Nigerian or Ghanaian or Rwandan or even the Ugandan is incapable of leading their country? That's what Yoweri Museveni will tell you. But B1 is too young, is too inexperienced to lead Uganda. That's absolute nonsense. That's what the APC will tell you in Nigeria. That only Buhari or old folks like Tinubu or the old cargos are the only one with the right experience to lead Nigeria in the 21st century in 2021. Whereas when they first came into power, they themselves were young folks. So we really need to go back and look at how much we've marginalized the youth and women. And we do not often talk about the women quite a lot, but we've marginalized women a lot. And indigenous African societies flourished to some extent, to a large extent, based on the input of women. I've talked about of course, Mr. Costa, you should be, sorry, Reverend Costa, you will be aware of how much the women of the Ashanti played in their political independence. Of course, everybody knows the story of Nanaya Santua, but not only Nanaya Santua, but other female figure in indigenous Africa, from Kimpa Vita in the Congo to Fumla Ransome Kuti in Nigeria
Mhm.
to the wife of Nelson Mandela. All these women across the continent, even in our indigenous society before the colonial era, our indigenous values placed premium on women. In Nigeria, in the Yoruba community, the economy is primarily run by the women. The Obas Council cannot hold a major discussion without the presence of the Iyalode or Yaloja, who can be regarded as the economic minister or finance minister.
Mhm.
The same thing applies across board. So why have we today then say women and young people cannot be experienced enough to lead Africa? So as again, it goes back to the whole idea of decolonizing the African mind. We are suffering from colonial hangover, and until we realize that and recalibrate our political and administrative structures, we will absolutely go nowhere.
So Ibrahim, how do we resolve that um, problem that you've espoused right now? How do we get over it?
Right.
Because
And
it
right.
seems time and tide waits for no man, and it feels like sometimes I look at it. I look at the whole situation. And I say, my God, we've been endowed with so many things, and these same young people that we're speaking about go back home. Say from here, from the Western world, go back home, and they become sort of swallowed with what is out there. So, what is plaguing us right now when it comes to the youth? Um, you see where I'm coming from? Uh, what should be the problem? I mean, the problem solver there.
Right. So I think not even any, majority of political problems are best solved through dialogues, through consultation. And of course, the first process of any fruitful dialogue is to first realize you have a problem. You cannot solve your malaria problem or your kidney problem until you first realize that you have those problems.
Hmm.
The problem with Africa of today is that we are not coming to terms with that reality. If you tell the Ugandan government, you tell Yoweri Museveni that the problem of Uganda today is because it's operating on ideas that cannot usher that country towards prosperity, Museveni will disagree with you. So how can you then expect that there will be a fruitful conversation that will pull Uganda out of its misery? It cannot happen. So first stage is for us to realize our problem. Second stage is to consult and have frank conversations. And when I mean frank conversation, I mean not to be not to create any boundary mechanisms or blocks that will say, okay, this conversation that we're trying to have, regardless of whatever outcome that it brings, we cannot separate as a country. Regardless of whatever outcomes it brings, we will not impeach the president. Regardless of whatever outcome, we will not readjust the key elements of our constitution. So, what's the essence of the discussion, anyways? These were the same problems Nigeria encountered, I think, in 2014 when they tried to have a what they call the national conference about the future of the country, since it became 100-year-old country. And eventually, many of the recommendations that emerged out of that conference were never adopted. Because right before the conference, people have said, regardless of whatever conversation we have, Nigeria cannot separate. Oh, sorry, Nigeria cannot
Break up.
um, break into its pre-colonial factions. And I don't think any conversation, any fruitful conversation can happen until you eliminate all this boundary mechanism. But again, going to the idea of why it seems like nobody can ever of the continent go forward, even if you are the most pristine person, it's because the structure of politics itself in Africa, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa, is so much disturbed and uh, stinking of inappropriacy, impunity, such that even if you are the most pristine person and you go into that political space, there is no way you can salvage yourself unless you decide to go against all protocols. If not, you will be consuming it.
Yeah.
That's why you see good people like many. I don't want to mention names. Good people go into politics in Nigeria, in Ghana, or elsewhere. Eventually, after 2 years, they become corrupt. Why? Because the system itself, the status quo, is corrupt itself. So until we have frank conversation and recalibrate our colonial mentality and our colonial hangover, decolonize our mind, we cannot move anywhere.
Father Kosa, any comment on that, please?
Yes. You know me on this already. That
Yes.
the reality for me has been the taste from the colonial master sport, be they food, fashion, ideology, governance, politics, even religion. I've always believed that Jesus will not come expecting the African Christian to look or worship like the European Christian. And yet, that is what is going on today. My brother, my friend Ibrahim, I probably want to ask this last question and provoke sentiment
As usual.
a little. Um, how do we deal with the taste of things European? See, we've been talking about this all this while. You are in the media, you are with think tanks. Sometimes I even believe the think tanks have become more Europeanized than the people they are trying to solve their problems. How do we deal with the taste of, is it European colonial masters? How do we deal with it practically and maybe promptly?
See, that's that's the one question that will bring some ironic smiles to the face of any historian of Africa. And I say this because one of the uh, most recurring advocacy among historians of Africa is that African history should be taught in classes. I do not know about Ghana, but I know about majority of African countries that you examine when you examine their primary school or elementary school curriculum to the secondary school or secondary school curriculums from primary school to secondary school or high school curriculum, they do not teach their own histories. If you want to attend a class on religious studies, I mean, I took religious studies in my secondary school. We call it Islamic religion knowledge and Christian religious studies. You have to take it's compulsory. Why did we not have anything about indigenous African religious studies?
Correct.
Because it's heathen, because it's diabolic, right? Because the white man came to Africa and said, whatever religious practices you have is diabolic, is heathen. You must only teach Islam or Christianity. Anything other than that is diabolic. So, how can he expect a society to move forward when at first he doesn't teach his own history? How many of our classes today we have children, we have sisters and brothers that are attending high schools? How many of them ever come back from school and say, "Oh, uncle or dad, we were taught about the first Ashanti Hini, or we talked about what's the name of this the first the priest that installed the first Ashanti Hini." Um, anyway, I can't remember the name.
Prempe,
How many? Yeah,
Prempe.
Prempeh first.
It's called Prempe.
That was the
Yes.
first. But I want to remember the name of the priest that installed him. Uh, anyway, anyway, what I'm trying to say in essence is that your the chances that your sibling or your child will come home and say that I learn about British history, or I learn about Obama, or I learn about the American Civil War, compared to learning about the Yoruba Civil Wars or the ancient empire or ancient kingdom of Great Zimbabwe, is very, very low. So if we do not teach our own history in classes, how do we expect to produce people that will understand their own problems, that will never taste or long for European alternatives? So if they're teaching our kids about economics as invented by European, they're teaching our kids in schools about ethics or civil studies or civic studies of ideas that emanated from the Enlightenment in Europe, or ideas of the American founding fathers as they form today, what we know as rule of law or democracy. If that's what they are teaching our children, how can you expect that child or those children to come home and never say they will prefer to wear a suit on Christmas than to wear a dashiki or agbada on Christmas? Of course they will.
Mm-hmm.
See, whatever education or educational structure through which you are educated or trained will inform your taste, your cultural taste. So the first step of decolonizing the African mind and decolonizing the African taste bud is to educate our children in our own history, in our own indigenous values. I see no reason why we must teach Christianity in schools and never teach indigenous Akan or Fanti religious values or indigenous Yoruba studies. It makes zero sense. Whatever society that neglects its history, that neglects its indigenous values, will never progress. The Chinese today, as much as they speak a lot of English or whatever, the primary language in China is Chinese. The primary language in Japan is Japan. Same thing as Russia, same thing as US, same thing as France. What developed country can you point to today that developed out of borrowed culture, where the first language is a foreign language? The British speak English because that's their indigenous language. So how can you expect to educate the next Ghanaian or Botswana president through English or through French, and you expect that person to come become the president and not or borrowed 100% foreign culture to impose on his people? You cannot educate your mind in foreign values. You have to educate your mind in your own indigenous values. So until that is the case, I don't think Africans should expect the continent to move forward. These are frank conversations we need to have at the highest level of the government. I've seen historians, some of my supervisors or colleagues, who are going back to Africa to engage African governments to review this curriculum. Education is the first step to development. If you do not rightly educate your people, if you do not have the right education, you cannot expect to progress. Indigenous African society had education. They had education. It might not be necessarily in the form of the European education, but they were education. We talk about the fact that Ethiopia is so great a civilization today in the whole of Africa, whereas Ethiopia, everything that had to do with Ethiopia was indigenous. Even when Christianity came to Ethiopia, they retained their own
Yes.
Orthodox Christian values. They never accepted Protestantism or Catholicism, regardless of whatever Portugal or Italy did in the 17th century. They retained their own Orthodox Christianity. Today, Tawahedo Orthodox Church of Ethiopia is one of the most influential in the world. Why? Because the Ethiopian never run away from their identity. So
Yeah.
why must the opposite be the case across Africa? It just really pisses me off many of times that I discuss it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. I think you are hitting a chord that resonates so
Yeah,
much with me.
that's right.
What kind of food knowledge are we feeding our people
Children, yeah.
so that the colonial machinery is still being oiled, even oiled by the African itself? We are oiling the same mentality that we say we are fighting against. We are making it run. We are making it work. And so the kind of leaders we have, and so the kind of critiques we have. I mean, how can you criticize somebody who is perpetuating a system that you subscribe to? You will not be able to. I mean, you take the issue of corruption, and within the African setting itself, right from the beginning, corruption has been dealt with. And yet Africa is so corrupt. It is because we are running a model that is averse to who we are. And so I'm really, really grateful for some of these discussions. And I believe that we can continue more. Come to think of it, can an African president go to the Chinese and speak English,
No.
even though their leaders speak English? You can speak your English, but they will speak and somebody will interpret it for you. Let me leave it here, Uncle Theo.
You see, to add to what you gentlemen are saying, when Nyerere assumed the presidency or power, you see, the whole of Tanzania, he never allowed anybody to learn English. Everything was in Swahili. Everything was in Swahili in schools and in the news media, and that was how those people, Nkrumah, I mean, Nkrumah, Nyerere, Azikiwe, and all those guys, they knew exactly where they were taking the continent to. Because you know what? They experienced what most people at that time had not experienced. They saw the good and the bad. They took the good out of it. Say, okay, let's go back home and then see how we can reshape the country where we were born in. So Kwame Nkrumah took it. And he took it right to them, and that was his cause too. That was the reason why he was taken out. Say, let's take this guy out because you know what, he's becoming too much. So you know what, like Father Kosa always say, our taste buds is killing us. It is killing us a lot. So just like Ibrahim, you're saying, there needs to be a lot of dialogue, serious one, deep thinking on the continent. I looked at some recent publications on your site, and I saw you had something there. America is right to reduce its troops in Africa. Yet, the president of Nigeria is asking the Americans to come to Africa.
Right. See? So you see that's a big example of what I'm actually trying to talk about. That uh, and I do maybe I'm gonna be disrespectful a little bit. Sometimes from the institutions that you expect common sense, you will be so disappointed at the rate of nonsense. So if you are having a security problem and you spend billions of dollars on firearms, the Nigerian government spend billions and billions of dollars annually on security. So if you claim that in the last 10 years you spend billions on security, and all of a sudden you have uh, 200 of your school children in a specific part of your country kidnapped by bandits or by so-called terrorists, and you evaluate and evaluate and evaluate, and you couldn't find any way out except to call on your fellow country, who of course have spent money on security as well, to come help you out. So you must then as well agree to one thing, that you have failed your people in terms of security. But they will never agree to that. They will never come to terms with that reality that they have failed. they will often find excuse, and that goes again to my problem of, first of all, you have to realize your problems before you can move away from them. So, I mean, how can a government be oftentimes depending on foreign assistance? And as I've said, it would depend on toothpick imported from Europe. We depend on tomato paste. Do you know how many tomato farms that we have in Chad, Niger, and Nigeria? The tomato farms in those three countries is enough to feed the whole West Africa. But we will import tomato paste from Europe. We will export our tomatoes and import them in tomato paste. We will export our oil in crude and import them in gasoline. So how can you expect a country or a continent to progress when it hasn't realized that it has problems, and when the captains of those countries do not understand what solving problem really is? So it's not only about decolonizing the African mind. There are two ways to pursue this change. First, through the government, and second, through the public. The African need to be decolonized. We need to learn that our own values are valuable, that our own tradition matters. That the way we solve corruption in indigenous societies should be the way we solve corruption today. If you come to indigenous Yoruba society, and you investigate how corruption was solved back then, if you are accused of grossly mismanaging the commonwealth of the village, you will be banished, or you will be left to the gods. And I mean, the bad spirits will be summoned to deal with you because you already taken an oath. So if the person doesn't die, he will suffer for the rest of his life. And as a result, his entire family becomes stigmatized. People will not marry into that family. But today, the most glamorous weddings in Lagos, the most glamorous birthdays are done or are in the name of people who have embezzled our money. And we will go on Instagram and like and comment, oh my God, I wish my wedding is going to be like this. Whereas those are the people that perhaps made your grandmother to pass away because they spent the money that should have kept your grandmother alive in the hospital, but they didn't invest in the hospital in the first place. But you're going to go on Instagram and like their videos and imagine your own wedding to be in the shape of their wedding. So decolonizing our mindset takes a lot of form. But again, it's multidimensional. Not only decolonizing the African mindset, but also pursuing change through the government. And of course, this is what we try to do with our think tank partners at the Atlas Network.
Father Kosa, any comment on that? Because I found it very interesting. And this is the same president, and this is the same leader who, when he was ill, had to go to Europe, and people were up and crying and said, "Well, you are leaving us," and he's not alone. During when the pandemic struck last year, nobody could do anything, but I always also go deep down into my thinking cap, and sometimes I look at myself and say, if you look at the so-called expatriates who go into Africa, or who go to Africa to work, they don't buy houses. They go there. To me, they are in a transitionary kind of thing. As soon as something happens, bingo, they leave. But we've been so magnetized with this Western kind of environment that which we've been talking about, the taste buds and stuff like that. You see, multi-millionaires, corrupt money launderers taking the money out of the continent to Europe. And then when something happens, they cannot even go and touch it. Mobutu did the same thing. Was it Yar'Adua in Nigeria? He did it. They always sort of siphon the money for development out there. So the sort of the caliber of leadership. Sometimes I sit back and say to myself, "Oh Lord, can't they see what is happening?" They come out of the country for medical assistance and go back, and they come out with these huge policy statements and all these kind of stuff, and and we look at ourselves and we say, when is this going to end? When is this going to end? But having said that, to be honest with you, it's been a very great pleasure having you to be on this program. Well, folks, you may visit www.ibrahimanoba.com. Folks, the recent publications that he has there would sort of blow you up. And this is the sort of African experts. When we say experts, we want African experts and not somebody else's expert, because he knows what he talks about. And we need young people to be involved in what we are doing. The conversation is what we are having right now. You see, we set up this radio station for something like this, to open up a platform where we can discuss issues that affects Africa and the Caribbean. We are one and the same. We are all crabs in a bucket. We are no different from each other. Because if you have crabs in a bucket and you pick one crab out, it's still a crab. We're all black people. We're all Africans. So we have to keep the conversation going. We have to teach the children the history, our struggles, where we've been, where we are, and where we are going. So platforms like this is what we need, not music. We belong to the boardrooms. We belong to the medical schools. We belong to the engineering professions and all this kind of stuff. Not, you know, you see young Africans walking, trekking in the Sahara Desert only to come and drown. What happened? We've been endowed with everything that the good Lord gave to mankind. Yet, we've been failed over and over and over again. Sometimes it's not about the political leadership. Sometimes it's about us. Because if I work in a ministry, and the other guy, Joe Blow, also works in the other ministry, and Joe Blow is taking bribes here and left, right and center, and he builds a mansion, my family will also want me to do the same thing, because if I don't do that, they tell me that I'm a failure. So you see, we have to look at the totality of the societies that we are building, that we have in Africa, just like how we're discussing right now. Take your money, build hospitals, help yourself and other citizens, but rather you prefer to take the money outside. Rather, you spending money to build your military, and you take you ask for help, just like Ibrahim said. Folks, there's a lot to discuss. Your final word, Ibrahim, please.
Thank you so much for the pleasure again. I recognize that your audience are Africans, and I often try not to make the disparity between the so-called Africans on the continent, African in North America, African in the Caribbean, or whatnot. Africans are Africans. So having said that, I want to admonish everybody to uh, keep up with the advice of our first Pan-African leaders. I'm talking about, and of course, many of us might not agree with their economic model, but they are still our political or social leaders. And I'm talking about individuals like W.E.B. Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Kwame Nkrumah, Marcus Garvey. These are individuals that set the agenda for African liberation. And today, many of the problems they try to solve is still in question. The idea that black people must be free, not only politically, but be free to be black people in any society, not having somebody knee on their neck, and it will take a whole country to rise up before justice can be served. So I want to admonish everybody to keep being an African in the sense of supporting other Africans. We should toward the Pan African way of thinking, seeing ourselves as one. There is no difference between any African in so far you are consciously African, you are African. If you're Caribbean, if you're Ghanaian or Nigerian, it doesn't matter. You are a black man, you are a black person. You should appreciate your heritage. You should be able to support other Africans and drive the African agenda forward. And the African agenda, to my opinion, in this century, is decolonizing the African mindset through proper education and, of course, keeping governments accountable and to question. And with that, I want to appreciate the time given by the your program, and for our listeners for their great audience as well.
Reverend Kosa, Final word.
Oh, I want to thank my brother Ibrahim for the discussion, and as I've always been saying, we can do it. We need to go back to where we fell, where we have fallen, pick up the pieces, and then move on. I believe we can make it. Let's be honest with ourselves. It's not going so well, and then we'll be able to get there. Africa, the solution to our problems lies within us, not from somewhere. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, I forgot.
I want to,
Okay,
Uncle Theo,
go ahead.
can I say this thing?
Go ahead.
Now, I'll be glad to talk about Ibrahim Anoba's Twitter account, and let's follow such young people,
Mhm.
like Love Bay Afrobeat Radio, Kenneth Kosa on YouTube, and follow Ibrahim at Ibrahim the underscore Anoba. Ibrahim underscore Anoba. And also let's go to the AfricanLiberty.org. AfricanLiberty.org. And we'll find a lot of his works there. And it will be greatly appreciated to promote one of our own and promote Africa. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ibrahim, thank you for your time. And, we appreciate what you've educated us. We hope you come back again, and then we will continue the dialogue, because we are just starting. We are just beginning to get warmed up. Um, you know, I said the other time that the best thing that ever happened to me is to see myself deep down, but mind, body, and soul, as an African. And with that, we end this week's program, Today's Africa, and we thank Mr. Ibrahim Anoba. You may visit him on ibrahimanoba.com. ibrahimanoba.com. ibrahimanoba.com, and then you see what he's done, and we will continue to support him. Ibrahim, thank you once again. And folks, take care of yourselves and each other. At 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Mr. Marcus and DJ Jantu Blue will be coming your way with a Caribbean flavor, where they take you island by island to give you the culture, the music, the history when it comes to the Caribbean. Thank you very much, and bye-bye.